Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Transport Topics webinar. My name is Kevin Ginty, and I'm the VP of Ad Sales here at Transport Topics. I'll also be serving as your moderator for today's program. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. We look forward to providing you some helpful information that you can use in your own business operations. That's the mission of Transport Topics and what we strive for in this informative webinar series. The title of today's webinar is 5 Trucking Trends to Keep Your Eyes On in 2020. Our presenter is from the Way Station Bypass Service Provider, PrePass. Kelly Frey is Chief Revenue Officer there and a connected vehicle expert and entrepreneur. Kelly previously served with several trucking technology companies in his more than 2 decades career, including being a co-founder of BigRoad. We will begin our presentation in just a moment, but first a few housekeeping items. I'd like to let everyone know that if you're experiencing any technical difficulties with either the audio or video portions of this program, you can call the following number for assistance: 1-800-785-5623. Again, for technical assistance, 1-800-785-5623. Here's a brief overview of our program. You can follow the presentation via the slide deck on screen. While this is taking place, please feel free to submit questions for our speaker. Please go to the ellipse icon at the bottom of your screen. When you click on it, a box will pop up where you can type your question, click send, and it will be submitted. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session and do our best to answer all of your questions. During this webinar, we will discuss 5 of the biggest trends affecting the trucking industry in 2020, as well as for many years to come. We'll start with a look at the effects of increasing marijuana use, then the changing demographics of truck drivers. This will be followed by a look at 3 technology areas: connected vehicles, the so-called Internet of Things, what many refer to as IoT for short, and then finally, trucking data security. And now to kick all of that off, here's Kelly Frey.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate being here today, and we recognize that everybody has time constraints, and we hope by the end of the webinar you picked up a couple of things that you can take back to the office and hopefully maybe make a decision or implement something that will help you get ahead of these trends. So we're going to look at the 5 trends that are on the slide, and they're all going to have an impact on trucking in 2020. We chose these topics because they're ones that we keep hearing about. We're getting the most questions about as we crisscross the country, attending dozens of conferences and state trucking associations, meetings, customer presentations, etc. We're also got quite an active blogging program, and we get a lot of input there from our customers and prospects. The things we'll talk about today are increasing marijuana use, changing truck driver demographics, connected vehicles, the Internet of Things, and the trucking data security concerns that you should have as a fleet operator. At the end of the webinar, we hope that you will have gained insight into how it will affect your fleet specifically, trucking more broadly, and not just in 2020, but in the years to come. And again, maybe just be able to take something back into the business that will set you up for some more success in the future. So marijuana and CBDs are here. If you like it or not, your marijuana policy or lack thereof may be helping you or hurting you. It's up to you to be proactive. It's also important on these topics to attract and retain a diverse driving pool. Very important for your fleet's ability to adapt to the changing demographics. It's going to help you directly affect your competitiveness and your ability to attract and retain the best drivers for your business. Connected vehicles are here, and the fleet and driver performance data can be gold, but you have to mine it. You need to ensure that you have easy access to actionable data for you and your team to make the best informed decisions. And the Internet of Things represents a massive opportunity for the trucking industry and your fleet. A lot of people don't think about it, but if you're prepared and informed of how to take advantage of the technologies to improve safety, customer experience, visibility for your shippers and your end customers, big things can happen that will make you more competitive. And finally, you don't need me to tell you that cyber attacks and data breaches are increasingly common. You may not have thought through why the trucking industry in particular is susceptible to cyber attacks and how to reduce your attack surface, as it's called, vulnerabilities. You'll notice on this slide there's an awful lot of green. It's a good map because you can see where marijuana use is legal, where it's legal for medical purposes, etc. And according to governing.com, as of June this year, states and the District of Columbia have laws broadly legalizing marijuana. The District of Columbia and 11 states have adopted the most expansive laws legalizing marijuana for recreational use. Others have legalized medical marijuana. Our neighbor to the north, where I happen to come from, Canada, became the first industrialized country in the world to legalize recreational marijuana just last October. So our driver pool now has much easier access to legal marijuana and derivative CBD products that can be smoked, eaten, drank, even rubbed on your skin. And we need to have a plan as an industry, and you need to have a plan for your fleet. The reason it's important is there was a study in 2018 by ATRI, the American Trucking Research Institute, that reported that marijuana impairment behind the wheel causes drivers to exhibit poor judgment, decreased motor coordination, and decreased reaction time. Likewise, the report says that marijuana impairment while driving is likely to become a larger problem as legal access to the drug increases. I think anybody who's reasonable will expect to see, as marijuana becomes more available, that people will use it a lot more, and that's going to cause some issues for the industry. So the things that you need to know if you're going to set up a marijuana policy, or just need to know as a fleet operator who's concerned about safety. Marijuana is still classified federally as a Schedule I controlled substance. And under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, a person is not physically qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle if he or she uses any Scheduled I controlled substance, including marijuana. Now, marijuana legalization proponents often argue that cannabis should be treated more like alcohol. Legal to use, but illegal to drive while impaired. The problem is, how do you enforce that? With alcohol, there's been decades of science have given us procedures and tests to determine the blood alcohol level at which a driver is impaired with reasonable accuracy. With marijuana, that's just simply not the case. And with marijuana, it's not clear what impairment looks like or what being under the influence really is. And I think anybody who knows somebody who smokes will know that. Some people have a big reaction, some people don't. And also, unlike other drugs and alcohol, marijuana is fat soluble. That means everything else will be out of your system, alcohol, drugs, etc., within about 96 hours, because you'll either sweat it out, pee it out, cry it out. But that's simply not the case with marijuana, because it's fat soluble. So that means the impairing effects of marijuana will dissipate far sooner than it disappears from your driver's system. So habitual or medical users of marijuana will have THC in their bodies, in their fat, in their brain, at a low level all the time. But the person might not be impaired at all, even though it's showing up in their blood. On the other hand, if someone's a first-time user, taking even a moderate dose of marijuana, that person could be very impaired, yet the blood content might be low. So you can start to see the issues when you've got something fat-soluble versus not. The other important thing to understand is, what does possession mean in terms of the law and specifically the FMCSA rules? Well, the rules from FMCSA prohibit motor carriers from allowing a driver to be on duty if he or she possesses or is under the influence of any Scheduled I controlled substance. So even if you've got a medical marijuana certificate, if you happen to have that in the bunk of the truck, you are not legally allowed to drive or on your possession. So we also got to look at CBD. Now, I got CBD oil on there, but there's many different ways that CBD can be derived, in pill form, eaten, as I said. So it's important for all employers and safety-sensitive employees to know that the DOT requires testing for marijuana, but not CBD. And this is an interesting problem, because the labeling of many CBD products may be misleading because the products contain much higher levels of THC than what product labels state. And there's no real uniformity to that yet. So your driver could test positive for marijuana even though they only used CBDs. And unfortunately, that's not going to be a defense if you get pulled into, an officer pulls you over or you get pulled into court. The other thing we hear a lot when we're talking and on the blog, et cetera, with fleets is this new use of hair testing versus urine testing. Urine testing is mandatory, obviously, for all CDL holders, but hair testing is becoming more prevalent, and we get a lot of questions about it. Should be the preferred method. And the reason is that some of the drugs will stay in the hair longer than what would be in your urine. So some people think it could be a better method. However, there was a university study found that a survey of the paired pre-employment urine and hair drug screenings of 151,000 truck drivers, so they had the same truck driver take both the urine test and a hair test. Of those 151,000, almost 13,000 failed the hair test. So if you took that same level of failure of hair versus urine and you applied that across the national driver population, what would happen is there'd be about 300,000 drivers would fail a hair test instead of the urine test. So you can imagine if that was applied as a rule and we had to now start doing hair testing, or if your fleet has decided to do hair testing versus urine testing, you may find you don't have as many drivers available for you to hire. Now, that might be a business a decision that you make. That might be a policy you want to introduce, but that could further reduce an already tight available driver pool. There was an interesting survey that was taken by CCJ. They interviewed 540 respondents, and they were asked if DOT regulations changed, reclassifying marijuana from a Schedule I drug, would you still hire a driver who tested positive for marijuana use? And you can see that there's a significant minority in the blue that would indicate that they would never hire a driver who tested positive for cannabis use. Real interesting, right? It's now available and legal in many states, but a lot of operators are saying, nope, still would not hire anybody who tested positive for marijuana. You can also see an almost equivalent amount in yellow that said it would be fine as long as the driver had not used cannabis within the last 8 hours before driving. Again, real interesting, right? How are you going to determine that? Are you going to ask the driver if they did? There's really no good way to determine that right now. And again, marijuana being fat soluble, it's not going to be out of their system. And a whole bunch of people, which is represented in purple, said maybe. So I think we can say the jury's still out, at least with that group. But experts recommend that you should definitely establish a policy and stay on top of regulations for your fleet. So even though today marijuana legalization is increasing, the number of fleets that we talk to that have a solid marijuana policy are still quite small. So you may want to get on top of that. So there also could be implications to your ability to attract and retrain drivers, especially younger or more diverse drivers that have ethnically diverse drivers that have different views of marijuana use than our traditional older driver pool. So we thought we would put together some best practices for a marijuana policy. They're pretty straightforward. Some of these you might have already thought about, but the most important thing is to have a policy, right? I think delaying having a marijuana policy is just not a good idea. Not having the conversation with your leadership group, not understanding how you're being affected is just not good. You can't hide under the covers for too long, so important to have a policy. I think it's very important to stay on top of changing regulations in your state and federally. It seems like every day somebody's got it on the ballot. Another state has got it on the ballot. As I said, it's very uncertain right now with regard to CBD oils and what their effect are going to be. We also got to evaluate drug testing options and choose the best for your policy. Right, so you may want to go hair testing if you want to be, absolutely sure there's no drugs in the system, but that may not be as, as good for your fleet if you still want to make sure that you're not disqualifying folks that shouldn't be there. And be upfront with your drivers and driver recruits about your policies. You don't want to hire people, bring them on, and then not be very clear with them about what your marijuana use policy is. It'd be much better that they knew upfront so they can make an informed decision. And then I think fifth, the most important thing is closely monitor your inspections, especially driver fitness. If you're starting to see that, your drivers perhaps are having, even small quantities of marijuana affecting your safety scores, so closely monitoring that with tools like we've got at PrePass where you can monitor your CSA basics, et cetera, real important. We also recommend that you evaluate how your marijuana policy may affect the type of driver you're attracting and retaining, as it could have implications to the diversity of the driver pool that's coming to work with you. So that takes us to our second trend. And again, this one's fairly obvious, but it has huge implications, right, which is the changing driver demographic. The driver pool is becoming more diverse all the time. I think we can all acknowledge that. Especially as the availability of drivers continues to be strained, we're having to look for other areas to get more people to come and drive our trucks. So traditional recruitment strategies need to adopt and change to attract and retain these more diverse drivers. And the diversity trend is accelerating as more people discover the opportunities that the driving profession can provide. You can imagine if we ever do get to that younger driver age that they're talking about, not having to wait till you're 21, that, you know, younger folks are a little bit more tuned into marijuana and are growing up where it's legal near them, so they may be more likely to be partaking before they drive the truck. There was a recent survey of the driver pool providing some interesting statistics. And some of these are probably familiar to you, but I think it's real important for you to take this back into your business, talk to your leadership team about how it's going to affect you today and in the future. What you can see is among younger truckers under the age of 35, more of them are women, more of them are Hispanic or Black, and more of them are educated than the older counterparts age 55 and older. You can see the dramatic difference in the ratio of Caucasian drivers as you move to the older age categories. There was an interesting discussion at the ATA meeting this year. Bob Costello, the chief economist of the American Trucking Associations, said, to meet the nation's freight demand, the industry will need to hire 1.1 million new truck drivers over the next decade. That's an average of 110,000 per year to replace retiring drivers and keep up with growth in the economy. So it goes without saying that in order to meet that much demand for new drivers, your fleet is going to have to attract non-traditional drivers. And it begs the question, are you set up to attract and to retain that more diverse driver set that you're going to need to stay ahead of the depleting driver pool or the diminishing driver pool? So some of the best practices for recruiting and retaining that more diverse pool. Some of these are obvious, but it's not that we think about these things every day. So one thing is a lot of fleets, there's a lot of good studies out there, have found that changing up their advertising strategies for different communities is important. So if you're trying to attract Latino folks or some Eastern European folks that maybe are trying to diversify your driver force, make sure that you're getting to them. Maybe there's certain newspapers or radio stations or blogs that they're listening to and reading. Make sure that you, if you can, have some bilingual staff in your recruiting and training department. Again, it seems kind of obvious, but, you know, folks want to work someplace where they can kind of see themselves, if possible, in that workforce. So having, you know, if you're trying to hire Spanish folks, have some Spanish-speaking folks there. If you know, maybe the East Indians are a good driver pool for you. Make sure you can try and have someone there in your driver force, in your staff. This came directly from one of the customers we work with, trying to work cultural sensitivity into recruiting and driver training programs. You know, you don't have to go crazy on this, but simply trying to have a policy and make sure that you're being culturally sensitive so that folks can feel comfortable when they come to work for you. And then in 2020, I don't know if you know this or not, but women comprise just shy of 8% of truck drivers. We're a sponsor, and we attend the Women in Trucking show every year, and their president, Ellen Voix, offers tips on how to draw in and keep more women as drivers in your fleet. There's a good top 10 list, actually, you can get just from hitting the Women in Trucking show or website. But one of them I like is let them know that you want to hire women. If your recruiting ads don't include women, you probably are not going to get their attention. So I thought that was pretty obvious, but one that sometimes I see overlooked. A lot of folks will use the same advertisements they've used for years, and they're, you know, just a regular white guy in it, and not trying to show a more diverse worker or a female in that ad. Also, the more you can remove physical aspects of the job, the easier it will be to recruit and retain women, and men for that matter. You know, she suggests that you order your trucks with as much technology as you can afford. That's going to make it easier for women drivers or even older drivers or maybe drivers who haven't had as much experience with a fully manual truck. These things might include automated transmissions, collision avoidance systems. Weigh scale bypassing is a good one. There's a lot of fear sometimes of having to pull into a weigh scale for new drivers. So, letting them bypass because you have a good safety score is a good one. They can bypass as much as 95% of the time for the folks that have a good safety score. All of that makes the day's driver easier and a lot easier to attract and retrain drivers. PrePass actually recently surveyed several hundred drivers and about the benefits they're most looking for when making a decision on a new fleet to drive for. As you would imagine, pay and compensation is right there at the top. We asked executives and drivers to rank the value of the benefits offered to the drivers. And you can see that, as I said, pay and compensation is at the top. Time at home and flexible hours, if the fleet is very important. And then the third one, which we were pretty proud about, is that if fleets provided weigh station bypass service. And that's just about reducing the hassles out on the road and helping them keep safer and more productive. But you can see the other ones there, which all make sense. Medical insurance, internet access was higher than I thought, but I guess that's becoming a norm that folks want to, drivers want to be able to have internet access when they're bunking for the evening, et cetera. Life insurance, 401ks. And I like the one on the bottom because I got a lot of dogs myself, is the pet policy. I think increasingly we all see it out on the road that someone's able to take, their pet on the road, and that's a very important thing for a lot of drivers. The number of options available when speccing a truck is truly immense, and will certainly include technologies that fall into the category of connected trucks, which is our next major trend for outlook in 2020. Connected trucks is something we probably hear some things about. Maybe we don't even think about it that much, but it's having huge implications for the data that's available and the compliance programs that we put in place. The basic definition of a connected truck is that it's connected to the internet and or connected to the infrastructure using wireless technology such as RFID transponders. In our case, we use RFID transponders and mobile apps to allow bypassing or toll payment as an example, but there's a lot of other reasons that trucks need to connect to infrastructure, and that's only increasing with the autonomous vehicles that are coming out and smart cities and smart roads implementations. Increasingly, there's also subcomponents, like an electronic logging device is a good example of a connected device that is allowing us to gather a lot of information and make the driver's day safer and more efficient. Or even trailers now that may also have and provide connectivity by providing the weights of the loads that's being carried, the available capacity, engine diagnostics, et cetera, et cetera. You could argue that with the ubiquity of smartphones that virtually every truck is connected already, and almost certainly every driver is connected. So you can see the numbers are astounding. It's estimated that 35 million trucks are connected to the internet today as they're driving around across the globe. And in North America, about 55% of all commercial vehicles that we'll be buying in 2025 are going to be already connected to the internet via the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer. So we'll have ELDs in them, but the trucks are also going to have internet connectivity so that the manufacturers can get the information that they want from the vehicles. In a recent study, nearly 40% of fleet managers feel that connected trucks is a must-have technology. There's an interesting article I read. Chris Reynolds, the Director of Safety and Security for Southeastern Freight Lines, noted that recently at first he wasn't entirely sold on one aspect of connected vehicles. It's called ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, or safety systems, depending on how you want to talk about it. So the concept of ADAS. And so to test it, he wasn't sold. Southeastern retrofitted ADAS systems in 10 of their over-the-road trucks and monitored them for 6 months just to see what the impact would be. And the results were pretty dramatic. There was a drastic reduction in rollover accidents by as much as 40%. Run-off-the-road accidents were decreased by 14%, and rear-end collisions were decreased by 22%. So those are big numbers. Imagine if you could do that across the entire fleet. So clearly beneficial for improving safety and liability risks. As we move forward towards smart cities, probably something you're starting to hear about, and smart roads, it's obvious that a smart truck is a necessity, right? We already use connected trucks to bypass weigh scales, pay tolls, monitor hours of service, location. Suffice it to say that this is only going to get easier as we move forward and continue. As technologists at PrePass, we need to make investments in the next generation of connected vehicle solutions, and fleets continue to embrace them to make the driver's day safer and more efficient. So some of the best practices that we recommend when it comes to connected trucks is make sure that you're making the best decisions to leverage existing technologies to maximize safety and efficiency. The ELD provides great data for monitoring risky driver behavior such as speeding or hard braking or following too close, etc. You may not be aware of features that your existing technology providers provide that can have an immediate impact on safety and efficiency. Things like driver fatigue monitoring using in-cab cameras or road safety alerts offered on mobile devices, like the one on this slide that's offered free of charge for PrePass subscribers that alert the drivers to hazards such as steep grades, high wind areas, construction zones, brake chain-up areas, etc. Those are increasingly becoming dynamic alerts, things related to construction or 511 alerts or available parking as an example. So I do want to present a word of caution, though, after talking to lots of fleets, is make sure, though, when you're considering any new ADAS or connected vehicle technologies, make sure to get the feedback from your drivers before implementing anything new. And you got to be sure to train them on how the systems may affect the way they're driving. You know, I hear lots of stories from drivers and fleet owners about introducing new features like collision avoidance is a good one, or in-cab cameras, because these have an effect on the way the drivers are driving the trucks. You know, I don't know if anyone's driven vehicles with collision avoidance. It's quite abrupt when those brakes hit, and if you're not ready for that, or when you have the lane departure warning, sometimes you get startled by these things. Increasingly with the fatigue monitoring, alarms will go off and alert that driver, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's not good, but it impacts the driver experience in the cab. You know, having been in this industry for 20-some plus years around telematics, I'm always nervous about introducing too many distractions to the driver. You know, you don't want too many bells and whistles going off. You don't want too many changes on the screens that they're looking at. So, you know, from a bypass perspective, we like to keep it real simple on a mobile app. Just pop it up and say there's a weigh scale coming, you've got a bypass, or if they're using the RFID transponder, just a simple light and a beep to make drivers aware that they've received a bypass or they have to pull in. And with so many things that affect the drivers, the more communication, the better, right? If you can stay on top of the technology, keep yourself informed, talk with vendors about what they got coming out, the better off you're going to be. So the next topic is, some people think is related to connected trucks, and it is. You could argue that an Internet of Things includes a connected truck. It's an Internet-connected thing, an Internet-connected device. But Internet of Things takes us to a deeper level. This is now the freight that's in the back of the truck, down sometimes to the item level. This is the tire and its pressure. This is the engine component, etc. So this one might be one you're not that familiar with, but I can tell you that potentially it could be the most impactful for transportation. So the term Internet of Things has been around since about 1999 and has transformed from literally just a vision to an inescapable reality. And it can be attributed to the extensive use of what's called Internet Protocol, the rise of ubiquitous computing and cellular connectivity, and the continued advancement of data analytics, among other drivers of development. Today, it's estimated that there are over 25 billion devices connected to the Internet of Things. And truly, we're only getting started. So the Internet of Things can be described as an extension of the Internet and other network connections to different sensors or devices or things, affording even simple objects, and you have them in our houses now, right? Light bulbs, locks, or on the truck, things such as tire, weight sensors, ELDs, engine and chassis components, smartphones. All of these things are Internet connected with an IP address and can be used to get more data and more information. So the key thing is interoperability amongst all of these IoT things. It's growing in popularity, and these connected or smart devices, as the IoT is often referred to, these things, have the ability to gather and share data from their environments with other devices and networks. So through the analysis and processing of the data, services can perform their function with little or no need for human interaction. They can also inform the human in the truck of things that are going on, right? The temperature's dropping in the reefer, the tire pressure's dropping on one of your tires, the brakes are too hot as you're driving through the intersection, giving them a green light at the intersection as you roll up. So with these IoT sensors, trucking companies, shippers, partners can potentially drive location of freight in transit, available capacity, the weight, the cube, the route driven, fuel efficiency, engine diagnostics, the amount of road tolls that have been incurred, and way stations bypassed if they're using PrePass. Internet of Things devices are very necessary precursors to the autonomous trucks of the future, and something you want to start to take advantage of to differentiate your offerings, improve safety and efficiency for your fleet and the motoring public, and keep your drivers safe and more productive. So when we look at Internet of Things and how is it that we would recommend that you get yourself prepared, on the right side of this slide, you'll notice that there's about 4 billion connected people today. These are people who have access to the internet. It's about a $4 trillion revenue opportunity globally. It's a massive, massive undertaking to connect all of these things to the internet. There's about 25 million apps available today. There have been over 1 billion app downloads just this past year on Apple. There's about, as I said earlier, about 25 billion connected devices and about 50 trillion gigabytes of data that are generated. So this is going to get us into our next topic in a second, but what I would suggest from a best practices perspective is leverage existing technologies like the cameras in the trucks, bypassing, ELDs, toll payment automation to maximize safety and efficiency for your drivers, but select suppliers that have a solid data security policy and solid infrastructure to make sure that your data is not making its way into other people's hands. This is important when it comes to compliance, right? The ELDs are generating a lot of data, but we got to make sure that that's our data. It's not getting shared improperly with other folks. Stay on top of new features that make the driver's day easier and safer when you spec the new trucks. I think that goes without saying. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Make sure your driver training considers these new features and how drivers will be impacted, right? As I talked earlier, there's lots of great toys that we can give the drivers, but sometimes when I see 3 or 4 different screens that they're looking at in the vehicle, that gets a little scary, right? There's lots of things going on. They're looking at their navigation. They're looking at their ELD. They're looking at, whatever else they've got popping up on their screens. And very importantly, have a data protection and security policy. As we get more and more connected trucks and devices from telematics and remote diagnostics to in-cab software and onboard Internet of Things devices like ELDs, each adds a new level of cybersecurity vulnerability. And that brings us to our 5th topic. So it seems like that almost every day, literally, at some company in the news is having been hacked for credit card information or customer information or personal health information, you name it. And increasingly companies, and especially including transportation companies, like the company here, Pemex, cited in this article, are being actually held for ransom after enduring a cyber attack. The Transport Topics article on the left indicates that transportation logistics companies are among the top 3 sectors hit hardest by cyber attacks in 2019. And the percentage of smaller and medium-sized trucking firms that are in that pool is much higher than the larger ones, probably because they don't have quite as formalized policies and maybe as much training. So since vehicle manufacturers during the same cycle share components from the same suppliers, the cybersecurity risks are increased according to the North American Vehicle Manufacturers Association. So, and this is a really interesting statistic. So 59% of all heavy trucks on the road today come from just 7 different heavy trucks, I should say, on 7 different model years. And it's because with tens of thousands of virtually identical configured vehicles, commercial trucks have a high level of what's called electronic homogeneity. They're very similar. That can enable an adversary to economically develop viable exploits that could attack large numbers of vehicles simultaneously. You can imagine the implications of a cyber attack on fleets could be devastating, right? Consider how the economy relies on ground transportation as part of the critical infrastructure. The transportation industry could certainly be a target for bad actor nation states. And there's already some indications that this is occurring. They're starting to see if they can get into the engine bus of the vehicle. They're trying to see if they can find vulnerabilities at your back office to disrupt the supply chain. And we're living in it right now with the coronavirus. You can see how fragile sometimes the global supply chains are. And if you can start to disrupt port operations, truck operations, things could get ugly fast. It's also important to note that the hackers are not just randomly picking the fleets that they're attacking. In the previous slide, or actually it's right up here, they'll spend a lot of time to test the security of a particular fleet and try different techniques to get at your data. This blew me away when I read this, but Harold Summerfield Jr., CEO of J&M Tank Lines, whose company was hit with ransomware attacks on 2 occasions, said that the hackers had spent up to 18 months prior to the ransom demand analyzing their computer systems before attacking it. So they were trying to find vulnerabilities, sending phishing emails, trying to gather passwords for 18 months prior to actually holding them for ransom. You know, so I like this quote. He said they're pretty smart people and they got a lot of time on their hands, which I think is very relevant. So when we looked at the best practices for data security, we take this very seriously at PrePass. We go through lots of audits. We have a defined security policy. So I think it's important, all of us who are in the trucking industry, there was a study put together by Auto ISAC. It's called the Industry's Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And they developed best practices for the heavy truck vehicle industry. They focus on 7 principles, which are on this slide. And the adoption of what they call security by design. And the best practices of that security by design infrastructure is make sure that you're assessing your risk and the nature of identified threats and vulnerabilities through a defined process that's consistent with the overall risk mitigation strategy of the company. Using threat monitoring to understand current and emerging threats and reduce enterprise risk. Right, and fleet risk, I should say. Identify threats and vulnerabilities through routine scanning, testing of the areas with the highest risk, right? What is your email password policy? What are how do you share passwords amongst the different systems that you have? Do they have to be renewed every month, every 3 months, etc.? Establishing standardized processes for identifying, measuring, and prioritizing cybersecurity risks. Creating and documenting an incident response plan. That includes identification, containment through remediation and recovery. Conducting periodic testing and incident simulations to facilitate the preparedness of the incident response team. At PrePass, as an example, we on a regular basis have a process where we have to go off-site to make sure that we can keep our systems up and running if there was a cyber attack or a natural disaster. Another key thing is establish training programs and awareness programs for internal stakeholders, as well as cybersecurity awareness around vehicle security, IT, mobile devices. You know, so if you have a mobile device in the cab of the truck and it gets stolen, do you have the appropriate what's called mobile device management software on there to be able to wipe it clean? Right? So if you got a truck sitting at the truck stop, that iPad might look real interesting to somebody. Well, make sure that you can wipe it clean if somebody steals it remotely. They also stress the importance of choosing vendors that have a published security policy and can demonstrate their information security infrastructure and chops to you with documented data security and information sharing policies that are considered best in class. So this kind of brings us to near the end here. I want to just go through the key takeaways, and then we're going to have some questions afterwards. But the key takeaways that we've had. So the most important thing is make sure that you develop a company marijuana policy, and I would make sure that that includes the use of CBDs and making sure that your drivers are informed and aware of your policy. Build a recruiting program to embrace diversity now before it becomes a real issue. As we heard, there's going to need 110,000 new drivers every year. That driver pool is getting more diverse, so you got to make sure that you're attracting and retaining the right drivers. Stay educated on connected truck and Internet of Things technologies and the return on investment for your fleet. These things are coming to you. You're buying vehicles that have connected technologies in them. Make sure they're the right ones for you and you're getting the full advantage and return on investment for that. Be proactive with your cybersecurity protection and seek vendors who take data security seriously. like PrePass, another little plug for us, we have a very well-defined security policy, and all of your vendors should have that. I recommend that you stay informed, and a good way to stay informed is on the PrePass blog. You can see the web address there in the PrePass resource library. And of course, our friends at Transport Topics who hosted this webinar today, have a lot of great topics, both digitally and in the print magazine, to stay on top of the latest trends. And we're big supporters of the state trucking associations, big supporters of the American Trucking Associations, and we attend trade shows, industry associations. We're big participants across the industry. You as well should get involved to make sure that you're staying on top of all of the things that are important to your fleet. So with that, I would like to turn it over for some questions and answers.
Yeah, Kelly, thank you so much for going over the top 5 trucking trends, and especially the shout out for Transport Topics. We'd love to hear that you're not only a reader but also a supporter. Again, if you'd like to submit a question today, please go to the ellipse icon at the bottom of your screen, which should allow you to type a question for us. We already have a few in here, so please keep them coming. Kelly, the first one. I operate a mostly dry van fleet in California where recreational marijuana use is legal. If I don't hire a driver, or if I fire a driver because of marijuana use, could I be exposed to a discrimination lawsuit?
Well, I think right now it's fairly clear that even though the state of California has legalized marijuana for recreational use and medicinal purposes, it's still, from the FMCSA regulations perspective and the DOT, it is still a Scheduled I drug, and your policy actually has to be that Scheduled I drugs are not allowed to be used while operating the motor vehicle, and your driver is not allowed to have possession of a Scheduled I drug, which is marijuana, in the vehicle or on their person when they're in care and control of that vehicle. So I don't believe, I'm not a lawyer, so you'd have to consult your lawyer. I do not believe that you would be could be claimed for discrimination in that case. But again, it's always best to talk to your lawyer. The area for me where it gets real interesting, well, it is just the legalization of marijuana, carrying marijuana across state jurisdictions from one state that's legal and one that's not. You know, I could see a driver having a little bit on his possession, decides to cross the state line, now all of a sudden gets pulled over, he gets in some legal trouble. That legal trouble then will reflect on the fleet. So that's scary. And then the other one is the use of CBDs. It's very unregulated right now, and there's a lot of misinformation. So, you know, I've heard guys that say, oh, it's just CBD that's in my vaping thing, my vape. You know, how much THC is in there? Are you getting high and you don't even know it? Are you, you know, they don't have to have the labels that other drugs have or other supplements, if that's where the category you put CBD. So it's just kind of a wild west, and I think the policy's really got to be, hey, if you're operating the motor vehicle, you can't be using CBDs, you know, unless, you know, somebody thinks otherwise.
That's a good rule of thumb. The second question, I am struggling to attract drivers for my small fleet. I get that I need to throw my net wider with a more diverse set of drivers, and in particular women and minorities, but I don't seem to be making any headway, excuse me. What should I be doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to know, not knowing specifically how you're trying to attract the drivers, but I mean, some of the best practices we talked about. Make sure that if you can, you've got the ability to have some bilingual speakers in your staff that can talk to some of those drivers. You know, they may not have the best control of English quite yet. You know, talking to someone of their same language could be very helpful. I think the biggest tip that when we've talked to fleets about this particular topic was make sure you're changing up your advertising to get to different areas that are not traditional for you. You know, maybe some more ethnic radio, maybe some more ethnic magazines. You know, some of the non-English magazines that are out there are a heck of a lot cheaper to advertise in, and maybe something you haven't really thought of that could be easy for you to take advantage of, both digitally and in print form. And I think also, you know, it was a pretty simple tip from the women in trucking, but, you know, make sure that your advertisements reflect the type of people you're hoping to attract. Make sure there's some women in there. Make sure there's some people of color in there, and make sure that you've got a diversity program so when they do become an employee that, you treat them well, and you can recognize perhaps their religion and the need to stop and pray at different times of the day. These sorts of things are, when you go through a cultural diversity training, they come up and you kind of go, yeah, that makes sense,
Great. Next question coming in. The new trucks I'm speccing have a lot of technology in them. I wonder if I am improving the safety with all this technology, or am I hurting it?
I love that question. Yeah, I mean, it's so true, right? When you think of all the things that are going on, it's funny, I just rented a car today, and it had so many things going on the dash. I was like trying to keep my eyes on the road, but I was trying to figure out what the heck are all the little the sensors and lights and stuff that were going off. So I think there's a fine line. You want to provide technologies to your drivers that are going to make their day safer, more efficient. Things like, obviously I'm from PrePass, so I like the ability for guys to bypass weigh scales if the fleet has achieved their safety score. I like the idea that they don't have to worry about making their toll payment. It's going to happen automatically for them. So those are things that we do, but make sure you don't put so much in the cab of the truck that's blinking and popping and doing everything for the drivers. Try and keep it to really one screen. PrePass is implemented on different telematics devices, be it a smartphone or a tablet. So we integrate right in with that ELD provider, that telematics provider, so it just simply pops up when the weigh scale's coming and it goes away when the weigh scale goes away. It's not taking attention away in another app for them to have to manage. So keep it simple. Bring the drivers along with you. Make sure they understand what you're going to spec, if it's collision avoidance, if it's lane departure, if it's automated transmissions. Get the drivers involved. Communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're hoping to achieve. And usually drivers, if you let them know that you're on their side, you're trying to make their day safer, you're trying to make their day more productive, you're trying to help them get home faster, without having to be out on the road as much, you're trying to help them maintain their logs better so they can be more professional. All of those things, if they understand why you're investing in this technology, you train them, you communicate, you'll have a heck of a lot better adoption.
Keeping the technology simple, it seems like all the cars around the truck should be doing the same thing. So hopefully we can all stay safe. Next question, IoT sounds cool, but I'm already struggling to stay on top of simple things like attracting the best drivers and getting good rates per mile. Why does this matter for me in 2020?
It's another good question, right? Like, some of these things you just want to be aware of. I'm not suggesting you go out and get your PhD in Internet of Things, but what I would suggest is that you stay on top of it, right? You just understand how it's affecting you. I think the things that we know today, when we order something on Amazon, let's say, and we can watch it from when the order is placed to when it leaves the depot to when it's en route to when it arrives at me, that constant tracking is enabled by Internet of Things. I can even get a picture of it from my Ring doorbell when it gets dropped at my front door. That's all examples of Internet of Things, right? Internet connected devices that are allowing me to stay informed as a consumer. Well, those same types of consumer expectations start to creep into the commercial expectations of the supply chain. Increasingly, people want to know, where is my load? What truck is it on? When's it going to be delivered? What was the humidity level of the load? What was the temperature of the load? When you put it on the dock, how long did it stay on the dock? Around the food supply chain is a great example. We can deliver that load to the back of the grocery store, but if it doesn't get taken in and put into the freezer, that could cause health issues. Well, if the trucking company can verify the internal temperature of the trailer as well as the specific temperature of the pallet when they gave it to the grocery store and handed that over, well, now it's the grocery store's responsibility to maintain that appropriate temperature. All of those things are handled by devices that would be categorized as Internet of Things devices. So you should be aware of the infrastructure that's available and the expectations so your trucking fleet can differentiate its offering, provide a higher level of data and information so that, again, the driving public is safer, the consuming public is safer, your drivers are safer, and everybody's more productive.
Great. It looks like we have one more question here. We have a lot of information about our route history, pickup locations, commodities, etc. that I don't want my competitors to get access to. What do you suggest we do about protecting our data in the cab on the telematics device?
Yeah, it's a really good one. I mentioned something that maybe some folks hadn't heard the term before. It's called MDM, Mobile Device Management. This is one of the critical things that every trucking fleet should have for any mobile device. This allows you to add applications, restrict applications, control the device, wipe it clean if it gets stolen. So that's, I'd say, one, is make sure that you implement and deploy mobile device management, and there's several good providers of that type of technology. I think it's important that you train your drivers about expectations related to security. So as an example, when they get out of that cab of the truck, maybe they need to log out of the device, right? Because if they're going into the truck stop or overnighting and somebody breaks in and takes that device and they're already logged in, and that logged in ID allows them to get access to email and access to internal systems, well, a savvy hacker could now use that to gain access to other parts of the organization. So that's two, I think, is train, communicate, and make sure the drivers understand their role in protecting the company. And then I think three, we spoke about, is make sure that your vendors have a published data security policy and information security policy. It's always good to go for the low, try and get the low-cost provider, but sometimes those low-cost providers might be flying a little fast and loose with your data. They may not have the same data security requirements that you uphold as your vendor upholds, or you as a trucking fleet upholds. So make sure you're kind of associating with the right type of supplier, the right type of vendor, and that they have information security programs that you feel are as robust as yours need to be.
Kelly, I know I told you that was our last question, but one just came in, and it looks like we've got a couple minutes remaining, so let me throw this one to you. In your personal opinion, do you think it's a bit of a stretch that one day the FMCSA will allow truckers to engage in the recreational use of marijuana, or might it happen once there is a way to detect use on the job, like there are for breathalyzers for alcohol?
Yeah, I think it'll be real interesting. I mean, you hit the nail on the head that, it's becoming, so it's actually interesting. There's a few responses to this. One is we're in an industry that is increasingly finding it difficult to find the number of drivers that we need, right? So anything that's going to affect the available pool of drivers is going to be negative. So increasingly, as recreational marijuana use and medical marijuana use is becoming legal in all of these different states, we don't want to be, necessarily the industry says, sorry, you can't work with us. However, we also are driving 80,000-pound trucks down the road. So we have to, realize that being impaired, no matter what way you're impaired, is just simply not good. So if there was a reliable test available for marijuana impairment, that would be awesome, right? Because then it's like, hey, dude, you drive this truck just like alcohol impairment. You get pulled over. If you're impaired, you're going to go to jail or lose your driver's license, but you're certainly going to be fired. So I think that would be good aspirationally if there was a reliable test. I have seen some talk about that. I've read a couple articles, but it sounds like it's pretty wacky science right now to be able to determine that. Even they're talking about a roadside sobriety test, similar to, kind of walking the line when you're trying to determine if some guy's drunk. What types of things can't people do real well when they're stoned on marijuana? I don't know what those things are. Maybe you pull out a bag of Fritos and see if they go for it, or if they really start laughing at a bad joke. I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see.
Great. And finally, what is the most interesting or unusual way you have seen a fleet do to try to attract a female and or a minority driver?
I think that, some of them are pretty obvious. It's having people that they can relate to themselves. So, having driver trainers that are female, having recruiters that are female, and then I think being very clear that you have, outfitted your trucks with technology like automated transmissions. I've even saw now you can spec a truck with backup technology, things to make the driver's day easier. Obviously, I'm a big believer in weigh scale bypassing, so they don't have to be worried about pulling into a weigh scale if they're not used to it, as long as the fleet maintains its safety record. So in terms of most innovative, those aren't really innovative. Actually, I guess, women in trucking, being a good sponsor of women in trucking, I think is a great one, right? I mean, if you can get out there and be a sponsor, maybe speak at the event, let them know that you're committed, right, in the long term to having a much higher percentage of women. I mean, when I see nationally that 8% of commercial driver licenses are held by women, that's pretty small when, 50% of the population is women. So I think a savvy trucking firm, trucking fleet would say, hey, women tend to be really good drivers. I don't know. I have seen some statistics. They tend to be a little safer, a little more reliable. I don't know why that is, but I have seen statistics like that. You can imagine as a competitive advantage, if you had more women in your fleet, you might find that you have less risk, less claims, less cost potentially. So it'll be interesting to see how the future holds for that.
Great, Kelly, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the group. With that, we've reached the end of our program. I'd like to thank all of you who have attended today's webinar. If you have any additional questions or would like more information, I'm sure Kelly would love to hear from you, and you can use the contact information in the bottom left-hand portion of your screen. If you know of someone who wanted to attend today's program but was unable to do so, or if you'd like to go back and review any or all of today's program, we'll have it available on our webinar archive page at ttnews.com/webinars. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, Kevin.